Buenos Días. Buenos Días, as you know, is hello or good day in Spanish. You see this picture of me there? I'm not a matador, but I love learning languages. And I have my own experience about learning languages. And that's what I want to share with you today, particularly as it applies to Spanish. Now, while we, whoops, that wasn't right. Now, while I talk, you can send in any questions you may have. You can send them in by Twitter, and I will try to reply to them either during the webinar or after the webinar. So I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes using these slides, and then we're going to have 30 minutes or however much time we need to answer questions that you may have. And you can ask your questions in different languages if you want. All right, now, I always say, and if you've watched my videos, you'll know that to me there are three key elements in language learning. One is your attitude towards the language, which is the most important, not only towards the language, but towards the whole process of learning. And so the first question has to be, why learn Spanish? Because if you're not interested in Spanish, if you don't want to learn Spanish, you're probably not going to succeed. So Spanish to me is one of the most useful and fun languages to learn. It's widely spoken throughout Latin America, obviously, in Spain. It's your first access to the Latin, to the Romance languages. It's easy to learn. Now, let's be a little bit careful with this. To really speak it well is not easy, but it's written the way it's pronounced. There's a lot of vocabulary in common with English, so it's relatively easy. And, of course, it uses the Latin alphabet. So if your language uses the Latin alphabet, it's easy for you. Spanish could be your first, second language, make you bilingual. And if you do that, you can learn a third language. And Spanish is associated with music and dance and sun and so forth. And the cultures vary from Mexico to Peru to Argentina to Spain. As I said, it's easy to read. And a lot of people travel to Spanish-speaking countries, whether it be Spain or Mexico or wherever. And particularly if you live in the States, the United States, Spanish can help you get a job because the Spanish speakers are a significant market in the United States. And research shows that learning another language is good for the brain. So there's lots of good reasons to learn Spanish. Now, again, if you've been following my videos, you know that the fastest and most painless and least expensive way to acquire the vocabulary you need and to become familiar with the language is to read and listen. When I study languages, I mostly listen, but read also an hour and a half a day. It gives my brain a chance to get used to the language. It allows me to notice things. So it's very, very important that you devote most of your time to reading and listening, but listen to things that you like. Listen to things that you find meaningful and interesting. And so one of my objectives today is to show you how you can quickly move to things of interest so you aren't constantly reading boring textbook type material. So you eventually should choose what you want to listen to or read. Now, Spanish is written the way it's pronounced. There's a few, call them different little usages that you may not be familiar with in your own language, like the double L in paella. It's not paella, it's paella. Okay, and the N with a tilde on top, as in España or Piña Colada. But these are things you're going to get used to very quickly. I've learned Chinese and Russian and Japanese with very different scripts. Spanish is relatively easy. One interesting thing, like whichever accent you choose to copy, it really doesn't matter. In Spain, Sergio García, the CI is pronounced like a TH in English. But in Latin America, it's pronounced Garcia. Other than that, the vowel sounds are relatively constant in Spanish. Unlike English, where you go from Australian to British to US South to Boston. In Spanish, the basic pronunciation of the vowel sounds is the same, but there are some differences. And you should just choose whichever pronunciation you prefer. But when I listen and read, I might read material from Latin America, from Spain, from Mexico, from Argentina. It doesn't matter. Mostly, I'm motivated by my interest in what I'm listening to and reading. And you've got to pay attention, all right? So in in English, QU is qua, but in Spanish, QU is like a K. Quiero una cerveza, okay? Whereas the qua sound is written with a CU. Cuando, calienta el sol, like the song, okay? The H isn't pronounced, so it's hasta la vista, right? And the R, people worry about the R, and particularly if it's a double R, it's a trilled R. Perro, you can go, 5 R's if you want. And if the R is at the beginning of the word, it's Ramón, it's a heavy R. A lot of people get worried about this R. My advice is get used to the language, get used to listening to it, notice it, and slowly start practicing letting the tip of your tongue kind of roll against the bottom of your, against your palate, all right? Wouldn't worry about it, okay? Similarly, for example, V and B are pronounced essentially the same. And those are the kinds of things that you should start to notice when you're listening to the language. All right, and the Spanish, when you're reading, they use punctuation and accent differently than we do. So every question has an interrogation or a question mark at the beginning and at the end. And in a variety of situations, often for questions, and to change the intonation of a word, you'll see an accent. So don't try and remember any of this stuff. Just start noticing that these things happen in the language. Okay? Because to me, language learning is not about intelligence. It's not, like, I'll give you an example. I read a very interesting book by a very intelligent person who describes, called Red Alert. It describes his experiences in Russia. Very intelligent person, lived there for 10 years. Not only can't speak Russian, he can't pronounce the names of Russian people. So intelligence doesn't equal success in language learning. Developing the ability to notice what's happening in the language is the key. All right? And you then train your brain. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how we can notice things and how we can develop, how we can train the brain to notice, and through noticing, then these new aspects, these different ways of expressing things start to become part of our natural process in the brain, all right? So I'm going to start with what I call the 12 core patterns, all right? Now, step back. I always say the key is to listen and read and to focus on things of interest to you, all right? So in the case of Spanish, my interests are in history and literature. I have lots of material, some of which is in our library at Link, which I like to listen to and read. The key for me is that I'm motivated by my interest in the content. And I'm not consciously trying to learn the language. I'm just letting the language wash over me. At Link, I'm saving words and phrases that then are highlighted in yellow. And through my interest in the subject matter, I am acquiring the language. However, there are things that we can do that will help us notice patterns in the language better. One of these things is to work on sort of a selection of sentences which focus on a particular pattern. So in these 12 core patterns here, I'm going to talk about 12 what I consider to be basic concepts that every language has to express. And if I then make another webinar on German or Japanese or Chinese or Russian, then I will talk about these same core patterns and how they are dealt with in other languages. But today, I'm going to talk about how they're dealt with in Spanish. And once we've got the core patterns, I'll go back a bit here. So in other words, things and people, verbs, what kind, where, whose, to whom, for whom, etc. How many, which, who, okay? Whenever, when, and then the whole issue of tenses. So that's what we're going to look, spend a little more time on. But once we got the basic patterns down, now we want to express certain concepts. We want to express the idea of probability, maybe, might, should, possibility, etc. So there's a bunch of expressions that relate to that. And I should say we have prepared in Link, and I'll get to this later, lessons with 10 or 15 or 20 sentences for each of these categories. And that is for you to go to not once, but 10 times. Go to it at an early stage in your learning, go to it later on, and again to refresh your ability to focus on certain specific aspects of the language. So probability, what if, reason or purpose, opinions, like how do you say, like in my opinion, I think, it seems to me, feelings, and then of course connector words like therefore, although, on the other hand, and so forth. And the third part of the sort of training the brain to focus is going to be certain keywords or trigger words that, again, help us express our thoughts more clearly. So those are kind of the three different types of patterns that we want to get at. But let's now move along to the first one in our basic patterns, which is things and people. In Spanish, the nouns have gender, masculine and feminine, all right? So those of you who are new to Spanish, this is important. Those of you who are already advanced in Spanish, you know this. And it's fairly consistent. In other words, any nouns that end in A, I shouldn't say any, but most nouns that end in A are feminine. Most nouns that end in DAD, universidad, or ION, la conversación, are going to be feminine. Whereas the nouns that end in O are going to be masculine. And the plural is formed by adding an S. Pretty straightforward. And you'll find in our link library, and give you a link to this later on, a bunch of drills where you can kind of concentrate on that. Don't worry about remembering it all the time. What you want to develop is that ability to notice. And almost automatically, if you start noticing, oh yeah, that's the masculine, that's the feminine, you're going to gradually start doing it automatically. All right? So that's, and the other thing about Spanish is they have articles, because not every language has articles. But in Spanish, just as in English, there are articles. Okay? There is the la or una, or el and un, or los. All right? Verbs. Verbs is the big bugbear for everybody studying Spanish, because, quite frankly, the verbs in Spanish do present a degree of complexity greater than many of the languages that I've studied, and more complex than Japanese and Chinese, than a number of languages. So you can look at these tables as much as you want. You're not going, in my experience, I cannot remember verb endings just by studying tables, but you can start noticing. So first of all, you'll notice that the verb endings change depending on whether it's I or you or he. So it changes for every, what we call, person. And for that reason, very often in Spanish, they don't include the first person. Because in English, if I say I go, if I just say go, you don't know if it's I go, you go, they go, you don't know. But in Spanish, you know. And so very often, you simply see the verb with no personal pronoun. All right? Another thing to start noticing is that amongst the so-called regular verbs, there are three groups: the AR verbs, the ER verbs, and the IR verbs. Now, don't try to remember anything, but do remember this. Anytime you need to know how a verb is conjugated, or anything to do with verbs, or anything else in Spanish, you just Google. The resources available on the internet for language learning are stupendous. You can download grammars, you can download tables, you can get any verb conjugated, and I frequently refer to Google when in doubt, whether it be in Spanish or even Romanian. But the resources for Spanish are just phenomenal. So do make use of Google as a reference. But again, I emphasize again, don't spend all your time studying tables. It's a relatively low product, ineffective thing to spend your time on. Spend most of your time listening and reading. All right. In every language, you want to say what? ¿Qué? ¿Qué es eso? What is that? ¿Qué es eso? I'm not going to give you any rules, but you have to become familiar with the fact and notice the fact that, again, what do we see? We see an upside-down question mark at the beginning of every question. We see that the question words have an accent on them. So just start noticing these things Or we see in ¿qué quieres? What do you want? There's no personal pronoun there. It's just ¿qué quieres? What do you want? We know it's quieres because it's the verb ending tells you that it's the second person singular. So again, there's lots of drills now that we put into the link library where you can go and concentrate on this expression of what. How do I say what? Because you're going to find that at various times in your language study, you're going to have trouble expressing some of these basic concepts. When you do, you should go back again to either our lessons in Link or some other place and drill yourself on some of these patterns. The best grammar book is one which has lots of examples and very few explanations, because our ability to learn through repeating examples, a concentrated collection of examples, is far greater than our ability to understand explanations. All right? So that's the what. What kind? And here we get to this whole question of ¿qué tipo is what kind? But we have adjectives. And what we have to start noticing here is that in most cases in Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun. Don't remember it. Just start noticing where it shows up. And the other thing we have to notice is that if we have los chicos altos, the adjective agrees with the noun. Okay, these are grammatical terms, but every time we say a chico is alto. If it's los chicos altos. So, you know, la casa is the house, la casa blanca. Blanca has to agree with casa, whereas un gran coche, and here we have the exception where sometimes the adjective comes before. So don't worry about it, just start noticing the agreement of adjectives and their position, all right? Then we have to compare things. So here again, él es más grande que ella. Remember the double L is like a paella, eh? Más grande. Lo más grande, the biggest. La más hermosa. And remember the H isn't pronounced. La más hermosa. So these are all, you're going to see them in the sample drills, and you can gradually get used to it. Similarly, you know, this, that, and those. You have to pay attention to when it's esta casa, aquellos over there, esa here, este here, and again, without trying to remember, get used to these patterns. Where again, you know, donde is the word for where, and you have to get used, and you'll go to our drills and practice there, here, above, below, etc. All right? And the whole question of this is handled differently in different languages. You know, ¿por quién doblan las campanas? For whom the bell tolls, right? To whom is the car? Whose car is this? All of these things you're going to be able to practice when you go to our lessons, and I'll give you a link to it later on. How is cómo, and cómo estás? How are you? ¿Cómo estás? Again, by now you're noticing, and I apologize if some of you are already advanced in Spanish, but I'm trying to cover also people who may be looking at learning Spanish for the first time. And so you have, again, the upside down question mark. You have an accent on cómo because it's a question word. And of course, estás has an accent because normally without that accent, it would be estas. And so these are the kinds of things that you're slowly going to get used to. And here you'll focus on how to express the concept of how and how many. Now, one thing about numbers, I find it very difficult to learn numbers. Many grammar books will give you numbers up front, and I just find it so difficult because numbers are so hardwired in my own language that it's very difficult to quickly get used to saying numbers in a different language. But in this section, when you go to our lessons, you'll be able to see many of these expressions that have to do with the issue of quantity. And who? This introduces, like, the man who lives in this house, the woman that I love, you know, the woman with whom I'm speaking. These are all this whole relative pronoun concept, which exists in every language, dealt with differently in each language. And this is, again, a concept that you should regularly refresh yourself on. Make sure you really nail this down. All right? Similarly for the concept of whichever, whenever, whatever. This is a concept that you have to work on. And all these expressions of time that will normally trigger one tense or another. And you should definitely focus on cuando is when, siempre, always, ahora, now, nunca, normalmente, antes, después, hasta, desde. These are expressions that you can't remember them all at once, but you can drill yourself regularly to get a sense of expressing when. All right? And this is the last of these slides. And, you know, one shouldn't be scared by Spanish tenses. It's something you're going to learn, but you're not going to learn it overnight. You're not going to look at this table that we've put here on the screen and be able to memorize all these endings. Just not going to happen. You're not going to immediately understand when the imperfect is used or the conditional or the subjunctive. It's not going to happen. However, by training yourself with these concentrated sentences, and then when you are reading and listening, trying to notice, trying to pay attention to how these verbs are used, you will gradually train the brain. So, we have, by the way, in our library, a lesson that was created for us by one of our members from Barcelona, Albert, and it's called Puntos de Vista, and there's 19 lessons, and he tells essentially the same story, 19 different ways, using different tenses, subjunctive, and so forth and so on, so that the core vocabulary remains the same, the story is the same, but the tenses change. And this is an example of the kind of concentrated listening that you can do that's going to help you to notice. However, you know, we can't listen to the same thing over and over again. It's important, if we talk about training the brain, we need to alternate between novelty and repetition. If you only give the brain repetition, the brain is going to turn off. The second, third, fourth, fifth time, you are no longer learning. There's a definite law of diminishing returns. So you have to have a balance between concentrated repetition and interesting things. And I believe that the balance should be 80% interesting things, exposure to the language, where you're trying to notice, and then occasionally going to the sort of repetitious exercises where you're kind of trying to focus and overwork, as if we were working out, overwork certain muscles, focus. And the reason I've set out these 12 areas here, 12 basic concepts, is that I want you to go to one at a time. Don't do all 12. Go to one at a time. There's a good 10, 15, 20 sentences in each of these 12 concept areas. Go there and work that one area. Work the one where you feel you have difficulty. And then go back to spending most of your time, enjoyably, hopefully, listening and reading. So, I've mentioned these lessons in our link library, and I'll leave you with a link to them. But when you go into a lesson, like this is category 12 here, tiempos verbales is tenses, and we've got a bunch of lessons, a bunch of example sentences. And if you go here, you can see, you click on this, which is our resources section. Every lesson in Link has resources behind it. It could be a translation, it could be notes or whatever. I shouldn't say every, but many of them do. You click there, and it's going to open up this translation to English. And if you then go, you will see that in the translation section, for each of these training exercises, and we're using this symbol, the focus symbol, because this is where you're going to focus on a particular concept. For each one of these, we've set up basically what some people call interlineal translation. In other words, each sentence appears in the translation section with the English underneath it. So that even if you don't understand as you're listening, what you want to do is focus on one aspect. So here we're focusing on tense. So, tu hermana juega con mi pelota. So you're going to focus on, that's the present tense. In fact, all of these in the first section are in the present, as is indicated on the right-hand side. And what I want people to do, if they're advanced, you can go in and save the odd word that you don't know. If you're a beginner, you may be overwhelmed by the amount of new vocabulary. Don't worry about it. Just make it a bit of an experience. See what you can notice. even if you notice something on every third sentence, it's giving you a little bit of exposure to the language. You go back and use one of our many beginner lessons at Link or other material that you may have, and then go back again, and you'll see that you'll understand more and more of this. So depending on your level in the language, this might be an introduction to these basic concepts, or it might be a chance to focus on one of them where you're having difficulty, or simply to refresh and sort of feel even more confident in your ability to use these tenses or expressions accurately. So I think I've spoken long enough. Again, this is a new experience for me. I don't know if people have questions. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to see these questions. But there you have it. And I suggest here that insofar as resources are concerned, that you go to this course in Link, and one at a time, or depending on your level, go through them. And we will be adding more. I've only added the first 12, and those were those basic grammatical concepts that I referred to, but I'll be adding the ones where it's helping you express yourself, you know, doubt, possibility, and so forth. And I also recommend for someone who is interested in working on tenses that you go to this other course in our library, Puntos de Vista. I've put, obviously, everybody knows Google, but Google is a tremendous resource for language learners. You can look for very specific or very general resources on just about any language you're studying, and so I just remind you that that is often a useful thing to do. Okay, there we go. The question: how to improve on vocab? Vocabulary comes from engagement with interesting content. It comes from a context, because a word isolated all by itself, if you were to read the dictionary, I think it would be very difficult to learn the words from the dictionary. So engage with interesting content. Ideally, I mean, we developed links because we think it's the best way to acquire vocabulary. You save words to a database. They are subsequently highlighted in yellow, which reminds you that you have seen them. You click, you see the meaning again. You see it in different contexts, and slowly it becomes a part of you. You can also flashcard. When I flashcard, in my own case, I put the meaning as well as the captured phrase on the front of the flashcard. So to me, it's just more exposure, and I flip through them relatively quickly. Now, no sound. Getting out. Buenos Días. Which accent have you adopted for Spanish? All right. I spent most of my formative period in learning Spanish in Spain. I traveled there when I was a student in France, and I've traveled there often on holidays. So that's what I'm comfortable with. But I think that Spanish is pronounced quite clearly, like in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina has a special sort of lilt to it. It really doesn't matter. It depends on your experience, your requirements, and so forth. Is la masculine or feminine? La is feminine. Always, always, always. Not every noun that ends in a is feminine, but 98%. But la is feminine. Someone can't hear me perfectly today. I don't know what I can do. Some people hear me, some people don't. How do you not mix up Spanish and French when speaking? I don't mix them up. I think, again, this issue of mixing languages, I think if we acquire our languages through massive listening and reading, these languages become sort of fixed in our brain, and we transfer ourselves over to our Spanish-speaking, control center, or our French-speaking control center, and there's relatively little overflow or overlap. If, on the other hand, we learn through trying to acquire certain rules of grammar and studying certain lists of vocabulary, I find that is a much more tenuous, a weak control over the language. So I don't have, because I focus entirely on massively on listening and reading. Yeah, occasionally, like a language that I don't speak well, like if I'm speaking Korean, I might slide into Japanese because the brain is looking for a foreign language and it goes to the wrong spot. But I know from experience that if I continue my listening and reading activity with Korean, eventually I won't make that mistake. So, no questions? Did you see this question? Do you see this question? Yes? Hello. What's the verb? Okay, the verb to be. In Spanish, we have this particular situation of ser and estar. Both mean to be. Now, the explanations that you'll find, and by the way, you can Google ser and estar, and you'll find ample explanation and ample, examples. But in a nutshell, ser is to be something that is essentially a part of your identity of who you are, that's permanent, whereas estar indicates a state of being that might change. So I think of the example, there's a, La Bamba, yo no soy marinero, soy capitán, soy capitán. So I'm not a sailor, I'm a captain. That's what I am, soy. But estoy feliz, I am happy. Estoy feliz. Tomorrow might be sad, but today I'm happy. So if you think of soy capitán, estoy feliz, that might help remind you of, when you go to use the word to be, whether it's a permanent situation or something that might change. Can you see this? Yes. How long have you been learning Spanish? What kind of tools are you using? Okay, I am not studying Spanish now. My exposure to Spanish was when I was a student in France. I would go hitchhiking in Spain in 1964, 65, 66. I would sit for hours and hours and hours with truck drivers and kind people who picked me up, and I read, because Spanish is easy to read. Spanish is one of these languages where you can very quickly get into real, meaningful adult material. And I suggest that anyone studying Spanish should read a lot, take advantage of the fact that it's easy to read, and get into real interesting material as quickly as possible. How does Spanish compare to German? To me, Spanish is a lot easier, because it's not that German isn't written phonetically, but there's a lot of letters that are kind of unnecessary, like SCH for sure. SH would do, based on my English background, I find Spanish easier, more, even though German is meant to be a Germanic language, I find that there's more vocabulary overlap with Spanish. So I found Spanish easier, but German, it's all a matter of interesting content. Once with German, I stopped trying to study the declension tables and found interesting content to listen to and read, my German improved immensely. So the key is to find things of interest to you. Okay, hi. Your information was very useful. I have a question, all right? Sir, you are a good prof. Vielen Dank für das interessante Webinar. Beste Grüße aus Deutschland. Thank you. That's from Mike Gebhardt. Can you see my question? Can you see this question? How do you listen? All right, how do you listen? When you start listening to a new language, it's just noise. You can't even tell where one word ends and the next word begins. So I listen to short, 30-second content for which I have the text, and that's why I use link, because I can read it, I can look up the words, and then I listen again, and I still don't understand. And then I read it, and I review the words that I looked up, and I understand it now, and then I listen, and I still can't get it. And so this process continues, and then I'll take another lesson, and after about 4 or 5 of these, I find that I'm able to understand more and more. But always, I read, and I say words from the text of whatever content I'm listening to. And over time, it's been my experience, my ability to understand what I'm listening to improves. And so initially, I'm listening quite often to the same material, 5, 6, 7, 10 times. And as I improve, I listen less often to the same content, because more and more now, I'm able to get into meaningful, interesting content where I'm driven more by my interest in the content rather than the sort of desire to drill the sounds into me. And so you gradually become a more and more sort of content-focused listener rather than listening for sort of specific words or patterns. However, you still want to try to maintain your focus on certain types of vocabulary or structures that give you difficulty. All right, for me as a beginner, but there's no question here. How is the best way to memorize vocabulary without burnout and get frustrated? I don't memorize vocabulary. I never memorize vocabulary. I keep listening and reading. I read in Link, where I can see the words that I've looked at before highlighted in yellow, and I'm motivated mostly by my interest in the content, so I don't get frustrated. I can't wait to get to the next content item, and if it's of interest to me, I struggle through the words that I don't know, looking them up and adding them to my basic vocabulary database, but I don't get frustrated. Do you have any advice on how to use a new language, particularly Spanish, in daily life when the people around you currently don't speak it? Very difficult, very difficult. I study Russian or Ukrainian or Korean here. I don't speak it very often. So I say my first goal is to understand it well, sort of preparing myself for the situation where I will have the opportunity or the need to use it. If you don't have the need or the opportunity, you have to create it. So inevitably, you have to set up some online discussion with a tutor, whether it be at italki or some other website or at Link, to start using it. But it's more difficult to do. You have to schedule it. You may have to pay the person. And in fact, even if you don't speak it, you can continue to improve your language potential, your capability in the language by this process of continuing to work on your comprehension. Because when you do have the opportunity to talk to someone, to me, the worst situation is if I don't understand what they're saying. I can struggle with what I have to say, and it doesn't bother me. And I think that's another important point. When you start to speak, you're going to stumble, you're going to struggle, and that's normal. And don't sort of look back and say, gee, I didn't do very well and I couldn't express myself. It doesn't matter. But the worst situation is if you don't understand what the other person is saying. And that's why I always put a major emphasis on comprehension, and that is building up my potential, to speak the language. And if I get the opportunity, I take maximum advantage. For example, did a lot of listening and reading of Czech. When I went to Prague, I contacted people there, lined up people so that I was speaking Czech for 7 hours a day. So when you get the opportunity, take maximum advantage, because in order to speak well, you have to speak a lot. But when you don't have the opportunity, continuing to listen and read is very good in terms of developing that potential. Steve, got any ideas how to go about learning the subjunctive mood? Learning it naturally by listening and reading might be extremely hard, I guess. All right, subjunctive mood. I think it's important to understand. I think the basic concept is not difficult. The basic concept is that where there is uncertainty or obligation or a number of other conditions, which you can find if you Google the Spanish subjunctive, when that condition exists, the verb will be in the subjunctive mood. So that's the basic general principle. Understanding that principle is not going to help you use the subjunctive properly. In order to use the subjunctive properly, you have to train yourself so that you start naturally, without even thinking about it, coming out with the subjunctive. Bear in mind, just like with any other difficulty in a foreign language, in other words, where this foreign language has some aspect that you don't have in your own language, you are only gradually going to improve or increase your level of accuracy. So you might get it right 10% of the time, and then 20, and then 30, and then 40. So you have to be patient in developing your accuracy in using the subjunctive. Now, in order to get better at the subjunctive, you need to first of all notice it in your listening and reading. So when I'm reading, if I have trouble with subjunctive, I would underline every instance of the subjunctive, or what I think is the subjunctive. I could be wrong. You should notice which words seem to trigger the subjunctive. Okay, and these are words that, or phrases that you can save at Link, for example, or underline them. And then you could go to the lesson that we're going to put into Link, where you can practice the subjunctive. And so you do this concentrated practice. But I should explain or confess that I never do exercises where, answer the following question, and I have to make sure that I use the subjunctive. I never do those. But I would go to the answers section where I would see 10 sentences answered in the subjunctive, and that gives me this concentrated exposure to examples of the subjunctive. Similarly, you can go to those exercises in the link and practice the subjunctive. And so you have to increase your ability to notice these examples of the subjunctive, and you will find gradually that naturally your accuracy in using the subjunctive will improve. I'd like to know if you feel you are quite fluent in Spanish. Yes, I think I'm quite fluent in Spanish. I have no trouble understanding. I have no trouble expressing myself. I make mistakes. But fluency doesn't imply perfection. Fluency to me is the ability to communicate more or less comfortably on a wide variety of subjects while making mistakes, while sometimes not understanding, and while sometimes searching for words. And I'm quite fluent in Spanish, although I never speak it, rarely. If I were to spend, an evening with Spanish speakers, then my fluency would improve. Thank you very much. Is it possible to start learning more than one language at the same time? Of course it's possible. I have found that difficult to do because I get so committed to the one language that I'm studying, because it's an almost emotional commitment. Don't underestimate the degree to which you have to commit yourself to the language, almost emotionally, and in terms of the time you're willing to commit to the language. So trying to do that with two languages at the same time is difficult. However, what you can do is start learning one new language, say 80% of the time, and sort of maintain or continue to improve in a language where you are already further along. Okay? What material did you use? For Spanish, I mean, I read books, spoke to people. Today, I don't do much in Spanish, but I have, for example, some podcasts from Cómo, Spanish podcast. I occasionally read the newspaper. My Spanish, I worked on, many, many years ago, so I haven't been doing much on Spanish recently. Would you please do a webinar in Japanese? Yes, if based on the experience here, if this is useful, I plan to do similar webinars on a number of other languages. Great presentation, thank you. I started to memorize to learn Spanish words. It is useful, and I found a lot of the words in the presentation familiar because of this. What are your thoughts on memorize? The key thing in language learning is to do things that you enjoy doing. Because if you enjoy doing them, you'll have a good attitude, you'll spend the time, the whole experience will be positive. I am not a fan of these dedicated vocabulary learning tools, whether it be Memrise, Anki, I can't remember the names of them, but other people love them, so that's fine. I learn so many words, like any language that I'm learning. My vocabulary count at link is, I'm learning thousands of words a year, like, I don't know, Czech, Ukrainian, Russian, Korean, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 words I have, according to our statistics at link. If I were to try to learn those all using some kind of memorizing system, I'd spend my whole day at it. So, no, I prefer to spend my time listening and reading and learning in link, and I don't use Memrise. But for those people who enjoy doing it, super. Again, I stress, we need so many words in order to be able to understand the native speaker. I just don't agree with the people who say with 500 words you can get by. Yeah, you can say, hello, I want a beer, where's the bathroom? Or you'll study sort of what to say in the bank, what to say in a restaurant, and when you go to the restaurant and you say whatever it is you were told to say, you won't understand what the other person is saying. So I believe in the importance of vocabulary, and I think vocabulary is best acquired through massive listening and reading. Can I count the 12 tips again? All right. Now the 12 tips, of course, had to do with the sort of 12 basic concepts in a language, basic grammar concepts. Remember, I had 3 groups. I had the sort of basic grammar column, the basic concepts. The second group was getting to expressing yourself, and the third group was trigger words. So insofar as the first group, and it would be the same in Russian, Chinese, Japanese, German, is things and people. Then second was verbs. Third was what, how do you say what? Fourth was what kind, which introduces adjectives and adverbs. fifth was where, including, prepositions of place. The sixth was to whom, by whom, whose, for whom, etc. Seventh was how. Eighth was how many, and introducing quantity and numbers. 9 was which and who, which is the whole relative clause issue. 10 was whichever, whenever, whatever. 11 was when, and 12 was tenses, basically. Now, we hopefully will have a copy of this webinar, which we will put up on YouTube, and possibly we can send a PDF around for those people who are interested. Next, do you recommend using language exchange? Absolutely, whatever you like doing. Personally, I don't do it because when I look at the time that I have available, it's difficult for me to schedule a discussion at a certain time in the day, whereas if I want to listen, I listen. I wash the dishes, I listen. I'm in the car, I'm listening. I want to grab a book, I sit down and read, or I want to read on my iPad. So to me, I don't use language exchange, but countless. It's one of the wonders of the internet that people can find friends and it's not just for learning languages. It's to meet people from different cultures and so forth. I heartily endorse the idea of language exchange. I make use of the language exchange facility that we have at Link, and so therefore I'm not on some of these other websites, but there's lots of them. Just Google language exchange and you'll find them. Okay, I may have missed, will the 12 content be available for other languages? If this is successful, yes, I hope to develop the same for other languages. What would be your best advice to learn any language in the world? I mean, everything that I'm saying applies to any language. Obviously, if the script is different, then you have to begin by learning the script, because reading is essential, in my opinion. And so, with Spanish, for an English speaker, Spanish, the writing system is not a problem. But if you, as an English speaker, are learning Russian, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, you have to learn the script, or Arabic, Farsi, whatever. I'm a native speaker of Japanese. Should I learn Spanish in English or Japanese? Interesting question. Interesting question. I think there will be far more resources available for learning Spanish with English as the sort of learner language. Far more resources by Googling or whatever it might be. On the other hand, I think it all depends on how well you speak English. To what extent English is, this is Takamatsu, to what extent you feel totally confident with English. Because I believe that when you're learning a language, contrary to some people who like the monolingual dictionary, I prefer to use a bilingual dictionary. So if I see the word in the target language, bingo, I see a suggestion of what that word means in my language. I don't want to have to struggle through some explanation in a language that I don't, feel totally confident in. So if you are very confident with your English, I would use English to learn Spanish. If you have any hesitation, I would use Japanese or use a mixture. All right. And at which level? I don't understand that. I don't know. We'll be able to download and watch this webinar. Yes. I'm considering learning either one. Which is easier? My native language is Cantonese. Second language is English. I don't see the first question for that. But the question about which should I learn always boils down to what are you most motivated to learn? That is overwhelmingly going to decide your success, your level of motivation. All right. By the way, congratulations for your present. Thank you. I'm learning Japanese and Chinese. I am learning Japanese and Chinese harder than Spanish because I'm learning them and more at the same time. Yeah, if you're learning more than one at the same time, it's difficult. I would focus on the one you're most motivated to learn. What's your opinion of Pimsleur and Michel Thomas? I am not a fan. Like, lots of people swear by Pimsleur, lots of people swear by Michel Thomas. The advantage of both of those is you just put it in your audio player and away you go. I prefer to listen to only the target language. And because I'm motivated and I'm aware of how much vocabulary I have to acquire, and because I consider the first goal of language learning is comprehension, that if I have a solid base in comprehension, the speaking will come. So therefore, I'm not so concerned about whether I can produce the language at an early stage. So for those reasons, I'm not such a big fan of of either Michel Thomas or Pimsleur. But that's me, and there are lots of people who love those two systems. How to start to speak, to break a barrier. I can write and read, but speaking is more difficult. Yeah, learning for 4 months. 4 months is nothing. When you start speaking, it's going to be difficult. You're going to stumble. You're used to being an adult speaker in your own language, and all of a sudden you're a child who can't say anything. It's a struggle. Unfortunately, that's part of language learning, and you just have to continue speaking and not worry about how you sound or how you do. Just keep going, and you won't get worse. You can only get better, and continue with the reading and listening. Do you think there is any particular Spanish-speaking country that's best to travel to when you're still trying to learn Spanish? Again, I've only been to Spain. I've been to Spain, Mexico, and Chile. Any one of those three. I don't think that there is a better country. It's just whatever your opportunities are and what you're motivated to do. Should I learn English and Spanish together? Again, I kind of addressed this. You know, learn the language that you're most motivated to learn, and I would focus on one at a time. So basically, you think the best way to start learning Spanish nowadays is using such internet resources as LINK. Also, does the Spanish in Spain and Latin America differ very much? Okay. I believe that Spanish is one language where you should read a lot because it's relatively easy to read. I believe that listening and reading, whether you do it in LINK or somewhere else, that should be your major point of emphasis. If you're starting from scratch, of course, you have to start with simple material. I would go and buy a simple book. The smaller the book, the better. You want to cover the grammar many, many times. Or use some of the resources we have at LINK. The quantity of beginner material that we have in our library at LINK is phenomenal. So take advantage. Thank you. Compliments. What is your opinion on learning multiple languages at the same time? All right. Again, I've dealt with this multiple language issue. I prefer concentrating on one. A language to learn at the same time as Spanish, although some people might disagree. Yeah, Portuguese, something that's relatively close, because you're learning, you know, the grammatical structure has so much similarity. The vocabulary is so similar that if I were to do two at once, I would take two very similar languages. I'm an intermediate Spanish speaker wanting to learn French. Do you recommend that I begin learning French? Absolutely. If you're motivated to learn French, go after French. Put, you know, 70% of your effort on French and 30% on Spanish. Concerning verbs, I'm wondering about how to learn reflexive verbs. Yo me voy, irse, yeah. Good. We will also put some drill sentences in there for reflexive verbs. How to learn them, it's the same as with any of these other things. You can Google Spanish reflexive verbs. You'll get a bunch of explanations, examples, review that. Then in your listening and reading, try to notice it, and slowly these things will start to become habit forming for you. In the future, for next time, it would be good to get up a whiteboard you can write on, all right? Along the lines of my previous question of which accent you've adopted, have you encountered any pushback from people wondering if you speak with a certain accent? For example, have you had Americans ask South America why you don't? Yeah. Yeah, this whole issue of accent, I think it's overdone. I think it doesn't matter. Insofar as listening to content, it doesn't matter. Acquiring vocabulary, there are some differences of vocabulary from country to country. Yes, I have occasionally had comments from people in Latin America saying, why do you speak with a Spanish accent? Overwhelmingly, no. People are very happy simply to communicate with me in Spanish. You know, when I was in Mexico, I mean, essentially, no, never, no real pushback. Have you a lesson series that is geared specifically to tourists to Mexico, which focuses on the language they would use specific to their travels? There are, I don't know, we have so much content in our libraries. However, I don't know that that's that meaningful. I think because you can't anticipate what the native speaker is going to say to you, I would still favor, and I always favor, staying, you know, trying to learn the language generally, building up my overall level in the language rather than trying to nail down some, you know, specific dialogue that might help me. Not sure I've lost interest or my life is too busy, but something has happened to my desire to learn Spanish. I was headed toward the advanced level or certainly I don't know. Okay, so a person has lost interest. What can I say? Find something of interest. You don't have to love the whole language. You don't have to love everything about the culture. This is what I've found. I very much focus on content of interest. If I'm listening, I focus on voices that I like. I try to find something that's interesting. Is it hard with an English speaker once you don't have an English? Whether the gender is difficult, every language has stuff that we don't have in our own language, and those things are difficult, and it just takes time to get used to it. Yes. Of all the Spanish books that you've read, which book was your favorite or had the best experience with? You know, I'm going from memory, but there was a book by a Basque writer on nationalism called El Bosque Originario, which I found very interesting, and La Sombra del Viento by Ruiz Zafón that I read recently. I can't remember. I enjoy whenever I read. Is it easy to learn Spanish when we speak French? Yes. You get confused between French and Spanish? No. Should I stop reading, listening Italian when I study Spanish? You needn't. No. Besides, are there many other rules of pronunciation in Spanish? Yeah, Google Spanish pronunciation. Do you find it helpful to learn a language by listening to the news in that language? Would that depend if you... It depends on my ability to understand the news, because it's important to listen to things that you also understand. I have spent all right. This person says they spend 3 hours a week. I mean, whatever time you can spend is good. You're always going to have difficulty, and you'll just gradually improve. I've been getting impatient with beginning Spanish material after studying advanced text in French. How do you establish a routine when beginning a new language? Go to link, take some of the beginning material there, and very quickly move to the more interesting material. Particularly at link, where you can look up the words you don't know. Very quickly we can graduate to, particularly someone who has learned French to an advanced level, and this is Kevin Martin. You can move up to interesting material very, very quickly. What do you think about Duolingo? Not for me, because, you know, to me it's just too limited. Here I listen. Dobra praca Steve, masz przyleżitość nigdy w żywocie mówić czeski. Okay, I won't mówić czeski today, but very nice informative webinar, blah, blah, blah. I understand 80% when I listen and read, but only 25% when I listen. Yeah, this is always going to be the case. You have to continue listening. It's gradually, believe it or not, it gets better. I'm at that stage with Korean right now. If I listen and read, I understand 80%. When I go away and I only listen, I understand 20, 30, depending on whether I'm able to grab that sort of context or not. How does your program differ from Rosetta Stone? Go and try it. It's completely different. That's all I can say. All right. Now, how do I not forget? I don't forget because I have learned it through a process of massive input. And that learning process ensures that the language stays with you. You may forget initially, but then you quickly relearn, and then the language is with you even stronger than before. French, do a webinar in French or about French, but in either case, yes, I can do. Entender, all right? If I'm only interested in football, how can I learn other words? Better expand your range of interest. Steve, ¿crees que es importante aprender los argots desde el principio? No, I am not a big fan of learning slang or argot. I think that comes later because it's very difficult to use it. But if it comes up in your reading, of course, you're going to try and learn it. But try not to use slang until you are very comfortable in the language. Steve, for me, creating is the most boring part, especially when I now start with Spanish a month ago. There's a lot of new words to learn and not that many Slovak link users. I have to look up all my words. Yeah, you got to go through the process of saving links. It's the most important activity of links, saving links. If there aren't many Slovak users, go to English. That's all I can say. Looking forward. Could you please say something in Russian? Я могу говорить по-русски. Okay, несколько фраз. There we go. Say some things in Russian. What tips would you give someone trying to get from an intermediate level to an advanced level? Massive listening and reading, and speak when you get the chance. How to not forget languages? Listen and read. Read a book every now and again. Are you going to learn some Polish? I'm dabbling in Polish, but I'm trying to get this Korean nailed down. Polish is going to be fun because it's remarkably similar to Ukrainian. If the script of a language is different, how would you recommend learning it? Yeah, learning the kana. You just got to do it. Google. I did it so many years ago. I have no advice. When will the PDF with the 12 core patterns will be sent to you? Yes. FSI to me is too boring. Thanks for answering my questions, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I have a question. How not to forget we've covered. Asimil is fine. It's a source of content. No, not much better than, in my opinion, than others. Somewhat expensive. Depends. Some are better than others. If you had to give only one piece of advice, what would that be? Try to enjoy your learning. I will do one about German. Yes, I will. You often talk about listening. Listening resources. I mean, start with our library at Link, and there's lots of other resources there as well in our import page, and you can go there and import material or just study it. How many words do we, and this is going to be the last question, how many words do we have to know to speak fluently? Depends on the language. You know, you have inflected languages like Slavic languages where the word count would be higher. But I think that it's somewhere around 10,000, you know, if we're talking fluently, a large number. But the key point is to continue enjoyably listening and reading, speaking whenever you can, not worrying about where you make mistakes, and trying to enjoy the whole process. So, thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and have a glass of water, and I hope that this has been enjoyable for you. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to shut this down now.